Just look at this fascinating map from a Zapotec community, Santa Maria Guelace, in the valley of Oaxaca. It dates from sometime around 1690 or afterwards, probably in the late Spanish colonial period, as it reflects some struggles over land that were characteristic of that time period. Indigenous cultural survival depended upon having continued access to agricultural land, where maize and beans and other crops could be grown to feed families. But after Europeans invaded and colonized this region, introducing unknown germs that led to periodic epidemics and the reduction of the local population, the colonizers gradually began building up their own agricultural and stock-raising estates, taking land away from native communities. Some communities also struggled with each other over land. Guelacé is one such community. Guelacé is the focus of this map, and its church, dedicated to St. Mary, looms large at the center of the map. The neighboring community of Tlacochahuaya, also a Zapotec town, was pushing out its boundaries in the 18th century. It appears in the lower right area of the map, which is the northeast corner, and its church is in the very corner. A great many of the houses that might seem to belong to Guelacé at first glance actually belong to Tlacochahuaya, as the little bits of texts, or glosses, on the map tell us. Another smaller neighboring town, called San Francisco La Chigolo, whose church appears just west of Tlacochahuaya, lost even more land in this period of struggle, and it came to be surrounded by Tlacochahuaya on 3 sides and by a private estate on the 4th side. So the town of San Francisco ended up with almost no land to farm. Adults from that town who survived the epidemics would have had to go seek work on the neighboring estates in order to feed their families. The private estate that was closing in on San Francisco appears on our map as a labor, which was a large agricultural parcel measuring 2,100 acres. This labor belonged to the Guelacé family. The main building of the labor has a pointed tower and ornate archways across the front. A worker, perhaps someone who has harvested produce, sits in front of the building, bent over with a large basket on his back. He looks tired. Nearby, we see another man with a heavy pack and a walking stick, possibly coming in from the fields. The Guelacé family name serves as a label on another building on the map at a place called Lotobo. This was an estancia, or a stock-raising enterprise. Interestingly, stock raising is visually indicated by the drawing of a cow near the building, with the cow serving almost as a glyph to represent stock raising. In its heyday, the Guelacé family owned thousands of cattle, sheep, and goats, plus a fair number of horses. These animals would have been wandering around, often trampling the cornfields of indigenous communities. At some point, the private estate that belonged to the Guelacé family fell into the hands of the church, and today it is in ruins. Perhaps the local people saw this as a kind of poetic justice. Guelacé suffered without enough land to feed its people. Eventually, some other neighbors showed the community some kindness. The Dominican friars, who lived at a monastery in Tlacochahuaya, gave Guelacé some of their land. And an hacienda, or private estate, named Los Negritos, ceded some land to Guelacé as well. We believe the name Negritos, small black objects, comes from some trees that produce a small black fruit. 2 árboles negritos appear on the map. When we visited this town in 2007, we walked out to see the Negritos trees. The members of the municipal council showed us the way. They explained that every year at harvest time, an altar was set up at the side of one of these 2 old trees to give thanks for the bountiful food of the harvest. The people of a neighboring town used to participate in this celebration, which shows us that animosities between towns were not automatic. This annual harvest celebration ceased happening only about 10 years ago. When we asked why was this spot chosen, our guides pointed to a mound where a pre-Columbian temple or palace had once stood, very near the trees. We walked over there, just a few yards away, and found, simply on top of the ground, bits of ancient pottery. We believe that the site has never been excavated by archaeologists. Just north of this sacred spot, running east and west, is a large, straight boundary line that goes from the fields of the valley up into the mountains. It is a line marked periodically by crosses and culminates at the Cruz de Mijangos, according to the map. The use of boundary lines with mounds and crosses was a practice that the Spanish colonizers introduced. That boundary line is still visible with the naked eye today. Glosses on the map at the top of the hill indicate that the slopes were divided between the hacienda of Chivaguia, the town of Guelacé, and the town of Tlacochahuaya. Interestingly, under the word este, in one of the glosses, we can see a large serpent stretched across the hilltop. The presence of this huge snake may suggest an indigenous person participated in the authorship for the map, even though the texts are in Spanish. Of course, the residents of Guelacé today are bilingual in Zapotec and Spanish, and perhaps that was the case in the late colonial period too. Serpents were regular features on native maps, and they play a major role in pre-Columbian beliefs about the creation and sustenance of life. Other indicators of indigenous authorship include the presence of a scorpion to the right of the church, that's on the north side, and a monkey on the far northern edge of the map. Monkeys are not native to this region. One wonders if some escaped companion to an organ grinder or a character in a local legend is featured. Monkeys were also day signs in the pre-Columbian calendar. Indigenous mapmakers were far more likely in this period to include creatures from the natural world than cartographers with European training who were making these kinds of maps as well. A second oversized serpent can be seen in the upper right or northwest corner of the map, coiled and looping over a tree. A bent-over old man with a cane appears nearby, as does a child or young person with an animal on a rope. Below the coiled serpent, we see a woman holding the hand of a child. These scenes of daily life infuse the map with great human interest. Other wonderful activities on the map that convey a sense of the kinds of things people might be doing in Guelacé in the 1700s include a man planting seeds in a field, possibly with open furrows made by an ox. This appears just north of the church. Below him, we see a priest with his long gown and hat, and near him, 3 people taking part in a religious procession, carrying banners on poles. The Camino Real, or Royal Road, runs through this town east of the church as it heads from Guatemala to the southeast toward the city of Oaxaca to the northwest. A river also bisects the town. The river provided water for the agricultural fields, for bathing, for washing clothing, and other necessities of life. One can see 2 people engaged in some activity at the river near the northwest corner of the church. Farther to the north, we also see a large bird at the river with a long beak and variegated feathers. Not far from the bird, we see a nude woman, much larger than any of the other people on the landscape. When we visited the village, we kept asking, what might that woman represent? We finally found a school teacher who told us some local folklore about this figure.
Bueno, según nuestros antepasados, nuestros padres más mayores, cuentan que hace años y todavía en la actualidad se aparece una mujer que aquí se le conoce con el sobrenombre o nombre de Matlacigua. Es una mujer que se aparece de repente en los caminos y a las personas a veces se las lleva caminando, pero se les nos aparece en figura de otra persona que conocemos, ¿sí? Entonces creen que es alguien que conocemos, la vamos siguiendo, y ya después de un determinado tiempo reacciona uno y se da uno cuenta que está perdido en un lugar lejano, del cerro o otro lado. Eso es lo que nos han contado nuestros abuelos, padres, tíos, y por eso sabemos de la Matlacigua.
Interesante. Entonces era un peligro.
Sí.
Como la Llorona.
Algo así parecido.
Parecido a la Llorona.
Y dice que se aparece por estos rumbos donde dice acá el paso del Tule.
También por los caminos del Tule casi aparece.
¿Y sigue apareciendo o ya no aparece esa persona?
Todavía, en algunos casos ahí de mi comunidad, como yo vivo en Rojas, hay personas que transitan, que compran pastura en el Tule y se les aparece y se han llevado así algunos. Pero sí, todavía la Matlacigua.
Interesante.
The story of the Matlatziwat, or net woman, is a variant on any number of local legends about phantom women who might be encountered next to rivers and lakes. One of the more famous figures of this type is called La Llorona in Spanish, the crying woman. It is interesting that the name applied to this figure on the map is a Nahuatl word, Matlatziwat, net woman, and yet this is a Zapotec town. Perhaps the school teacher did not know the Zapotec word for a story that crosses ethnic lines. It may be that Nahua colonizers who came on the scene during the 15th century expansion of the Aztec Empire introduced the legend of Matlatziwat. Or perhaps this lore came from Nahuas in the area during the Spanish colonial period. It's something of a mystery and one of the things that makes this map so intriguing. Two other minor details introduce additional intrigue. One is a figure on the map who appears just a bit to the north of the farmer seeding the field with his ox. This seems to be a man holding up a sword in a stance that suggests he could be ready to fight. Does this symbolize the tensions in the struggle over land? Also, to the left of the boundary line that runs up the mountain, we see a man standing with his arms extended, and in one hand he seems to hold a staff, something like the staff of a fiscal, or local indigenous religious official. His stance is also reminiscent of the town founder in a series of contrived maps made and distributed around Mexico by a man named Manuel Ramirez de Arellano in the late 19th and early 20th century, but with early 17th century dates inserted into them. I do not mean to imply, though, that this map from Guelacé is contrived, just that this type of town-founding figure can be found standing on the landscape in a range of manuscript maps. In colonial Mexico, maps produced by indigenous communities sometimes had details that showed a connection with ways of painting on paper that were practiced long before any European ever walked on this soil. The existence of this map and such stylistics is in itself a type of indigenous cultural survival. Any map authored by an indigenous community presents unparalleled access to points of views expressed by colonized peoples. To conclude, this fascinating map from Guelacé is a window onto a contentious time in the town's history when communities and private individuals were trying either to defend or more aggressively expand their boundaries to take up more of the beautiful, fertile valley land in this region. It is a story interwoven with evidence of differing worldviews and power differentials. Some towns came out okay, and some lost ground, literally. One town, called Santo Domingo, mentioned in the text just below the negritos trees, disappeared altogether. But in a visit in 2007 to the town of Guelacé, we were delighted to find that the town was not only holding on, but still speaking their own language of Zapotec and practicing some of their ancient traditions.